Good evening, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Vanessa Varden, and I am the director of the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Today, we are very pleased to welcome a diverse panel to the Council in partnership with Immersion, who are hosting their annual U.S. Latin America Business Development Conference here in Chicago. Welcome to all of you who are attending us today through Immersion. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. Today's event is on the record and is being live streamed. So while we always welcome your social media engagement, please silence your phones while you have them out tweeting and doing such. I'd also like to remind you that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Later, I will be rejoining the stage to take audience Q&A from the room as well as online through our platform ccga.live. So just take any of your web-enabled devices and navigate to that URL to submit a question online, especially if you're joining us via live stream. That's a great way to engage. We'll also be taking in-room audience questions. Before I turn it over to our speakers, a few brief words of introduction. Mark Chandler is Chief Market Economist at Bannockburn Global Forex, LLC. Previously, he worked as the Global Head of Currency Strategy for both HSBC and Brown Brothers Harriman. Antonio Ortiz Mena is Senior Vice President at Albright Stonebridge Group, where he provides strategic counsel and assistance to clients across Latin America. Previously, he served as the Head of Economic Affairs at the Embassy of Mexico in the U.S., where he served as the embassy liaison with the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And Beatriz Vivas is Consul General for Argentina here in Chicago. Previously, she served more than 25 years, specializing in multilateral negotiations, and was deputy negotiator for Argentina to the UN and at Mercosur. And our moderator this evening is Stephen Marks. He is Managing Director of Immersion and focuses on socioeconomic and investment-related issues between the Americas. So please join me in welcoming our speakers to our platform, and I'll see you in about 40 minutes for Q&A.
Vanessa, thank you very much, and a big welcome to everybody who traveled here today from various parts of this hemisphere. So thank you for joining. As we start, I actually want to turn it over to Mark Chandler. You and I have had some conversations recently about the current state of the global economy. Can you shed some light on where we're at and how it may impact the relationship between North and South America?
Sure. I would describe broadly what's happening, two major forces. I think one is just a general economic slowdown throughout the major industrialized countries and many emerging markets. So you have a slowdown, and that's being complicated or compounded by a trade conflict between the U.S. and China. And I think that the trade conflict represents a deeper economic force that's happening. And I think it's a big challenge for countries that are dependent on exporting, like so many South American countries are, especially these natural resources. I think that this rise of economic nationalism, and so after we had the great financial crisis, like what's replacing those kind of institutions and what's happened, what's filled that vacuum? It seems to me that economic nationalism, which moves away from the global free trade, which promoted so much growth previously. And so my concern overall would be that this combination of slowing global growth and a movement away from free trade. And that's not just free trade in the sort of an ideological sense, it's moving away from the multilateral aspect of, let's say, the WTO.
We're talking about trade, and the next question would be around trade agreements. Antonio, in your experience and your current position, when you look at new NAFTA USMCA, what is your viewpoint of that agreement? Is this a step forward? Is this a step backwards? Is it even going to pass?
Thank you, and it's great to be here at the Chicago Council. Last time I was here, we had the polar vortex, so I'm doubly glad that the weather's beautiful and I'm here again. I just had to say that.
The Latinos love that, so yeah. It's much better that the weather is yes. Great.
So I think that the USMCA is a step forward and a step back. I think it's a step forward because NAFTA was an old agreement. It was negotiated from 1990 to 1992. There's not a whole lot of coverage about e-commerce because there was no e-commerce, right? To give you an idea. So it badly needed to be modernized, and it was modernized. It had 22 chapters. Now the USMCA has 34 chapters. A lot of them taken from the TPP, which is supposedly one of the most horrible agreements, but now it's part of the USMCA. So I think that's positive. What do I think is negative? I think it's negative in the sense that investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms have become more convoluted and complicated and less reliable. We can talk about that later. Dispute settlement in general still does not provide a lot of certainty. There were some problems with the previous system. The new system was not fixed. And in general, I think we're moving more towards economic nationalism or managed trade. For example, the auto rules of origin are not only very high, 75% regional common, but very complex and convoluted. And that will be very difficult for companies to comply with that and remain competitive outside the North American region. I think on balance, it is somewhat of a missed opportunity, but given the global turmoil and the weakness of the WTO, it is much better to have USMCA than to have nothing. And I think at some point, NAFTA will have to go and we will have to transition to the USMCA.
Now, Beatriz, you were previously a negotiator on behalf of the Argentinian government for Mercosur, the South American trade agreement. This is something that we as a business and in our experience in Latin America, we have found great benefit to the Mercosur relationship. Now, there seems to be a little bit of stress even within outside treaties with different blocs. In your opinion, is Mercosur a solution or is it potentially a step backwards?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, for this question. I think that Mercosur is always something that has helped a lot to our countries, the countries that we share the same idea of having more trade, and because we all agree that we prefer a trade based on certain rules, and also we had to cope with different interests to protect, because there are countries who have more stronger economies or manufacturing sector than others. So in any case, I think Mercosur is completely alive, and it's always a good point. And recently, to show how important it is, we have ended after 20 years of negotiations. We have signed the one agreement with the European Union. And this is not a small feast, even though if we have we need some time to because we are talking about 27 countries for the European Union and 4 countries for the Mercosur, and now the documents are being translated and then it's going to be submitted to the different parliaments. But it's not a small feat to recognize that we have agreed on certain very important issues that made that it was very hard before, because there are sensitive things like automotive industries. Argentina is one of the major food exporters countries, so we are waiting for many of our products who are very competitive to reach a bigger market. And we are talking here about 800 million of people, consumers, which in terms of populations is, I think, one of the biggest agreements ever in the world. So, and we know that it wasn't perfectly free trade before, and even though if there is stress and going to protectionism, it's not that before it was a walk in the park. Before there were many trade problems, non-tariff also regulations. So of course, we see that with Brexit, the trade between China and US, there is a lot of, there is some temptation to see as protectionists coming back, but there are some places where agreements are still quite alive. And we mentioned recently the agreement. And we as Mercosur, we are discussing now new agreements with Singapore, with Canada, with EFTA. So I think we have to be worried a little bit because everybody is recognizing that there are some protectionism trade racing, but there are also very signs that people want trade based on rules because that promotes better growth for everybody.
Well, this, I think, very topically speaking, Mark, you and I were just talking about personalities just a few minutes ago, that it's sometimes hard to align personalities within a bloc. I mean, you look at Mercosur, the alignment of South American governments into one trading bloc. Very similarly in Europe, you have to find a way to get all of the members within the same, let's say, mindset to really, in order to make an impact. Now, we're seeing this being challenged in almost every major region in the world. What is your viewpoint on this economic nationalism topic?
Yeah, so how I would conceive of it, I fully agree. So we have the U.S. and Mexico and Canada negotiated a new agreement to replace NAFTA. Mercosur has a recent agreement with the EU. I think these are all positive steps, but the problem, I think, is that the passage of these. So two things. One is if they don't pass, and the other is if they do pass. In some ways, so if they do pass, what are we really talking about? In some ways, it's not a WTO function. It's a question of really the balance between regionalism and the global aspect. And what concerns me in this economic nationalism is, so the opposite of economic nationalism, the kind of imperfect world we've lived in, I think was one that was characterized by promoting globally free trade in general. But what the alternative was really the spheres of influence, which really characterized like 19th century diplomacy. So that the reason that Hong Kong went back to China was because the UK had it as a colony for 100 years and had to give it back. And I think that the risk is that this economic nationalism turns into regionalism. And I find, we're just watching the markets, that oftentimes as the US and China find some equilibrium, some kind of brief tariff truce, if you will, that's when the U.S. is harder on Latin America, or is harder on Europe. And I think that's what the next step is going to be. I think that the focus now will go from maybe a little bit of a truce with China, because whenever we don't get a truce with China, the stock market falls. And so I think that we move to being, WTO had a ruling about the illegal subsidies on Airbus, and the U.S. now has been given the authority to sanction about $8 billion worth of EU goods. And so I'm concerned that the U.S. Congress might not pass the U.S. The MCA by the in time for the 2020 election. And I'm afraid that in Europe there's also a type of economic nationalism. We saw how long it took them to get a free trade agreement with Canada. And I'm told that Canadians are so polite that if you want to know who the Canadian is in the room, you step on everybody's toes and the first one to apologize. So the EU can't get a trade. And so now I think that we have a problem with Austria. Every country in the EU has got to approve of the agreement. And Austria seems to be the first one to be balking. But this is a long-term process. It could take several years before it can be completely approved, and then you have the new governments, and that's where I think that the alignment of the personalities come into play, the alignment of the governments who are willing to embrace these kind of efforts.
I think that's a really interesting point. And while you were describing this disruption, Antonio, it makes me think, could cooperation between Latin American countries be a model for the developing world?
I sense that there's some positive movement in Latin America. For example, we haven't mentioned the Pacific Alliance, which is an agreement
Absolutely.
between Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And there are a lot of states that have different degrees of association with that. And I think that could be a model. So that is not only regional, that is to say Pacific, Latin America, but more open, a more open type of regionalism. And I think that there's a second component to that agreement that is interesting. Old style trade agreements talked about removing things, reduce barriers, lower tariffs, remove obstacles. While the Pacific Alliance talks about this, it also talks about promotion. Let us get together to promote regional trade and investment. Let us have business leaders from the different countries work and think together. I think this is maybe a more constructive way to deal with economic nationalism, see how we can work together than just, for example, using national security restrictions to ride roughshod over normal trade rules.
And I think that I would agree with that point, and I would say, turning it over to you, Beatrice, is looking at some of the rules and regulations from a regulatory standpoint. Work has to be done in Latin America and in South America to make it easier for trade. What are some of those initiatives that either the Argentinian government or some of your neighbors are taking in order to make it easier for the free flow of capital and goods?
Well, I think that as we were talking about personalities, it's important to make a difference between sometimes the speech and how we perceive the governments. But for example, you can think that one of the biggest countries in the region is a protectionist, but in the Mercosur, what we are doing is trying to lower the tariffs. And it's the complete opposite movement. We are not raising them. We are considering that they are too high because the average is 11, 13, 15% rate. And we think, well, that's a little bit too high for a world. We are trying to remove obstacles and to look for more trade. So the discussions that are right now taking place in Mercosur and mostly Brazil and Argentina is how to lower those rates and how to make easier the regulatory frame, so it's not that complicated to have your business, and most of the changes are related to the custom and borders protection. So how can we make so goods can go from one country to the other one in the easiest way? So. And from the political point of view, the way we are looking to do is how can we make more performance for the economies, for example, regarding regulatory frame, also for the labor market, how Brazil and Argentina, they are both discussing all the pension system, the work market, the agreement, the unions, their participations in the production process. So that's those are the big titles that we are trying to focus on.
And I would also add Colombia to that list as well. There has been some initiatives that the Duque government has put forth to help lower or at least allow for deregulation. Now, Mark, you and I sat down a few months ago and we had a good conversation around the region and attitudes towards entrepreneurialism and cross-border trade and investment. And you made a very interesting point that I thought was very relevant from a U.S. perspective. You were talking about there not having been a bourgeois revolution. That and what we're seeing as a group, that we are seeing some initiatives and turnover into new generations who are helping to try to modernize these economies. I was hoping you could maybe dig into that a little bit and tell us your viewpoint.
Yeah, so this is just from a really macro, very large point of view. That's not going to help anybody make any money today or tomorrow, no way to invest. But it seems to me that Latin America gets the freedom from the European colonial powers much earlier than Asia. So when the imperial powers are effectively chased out, it's the landed elite that run a lot of the countries. And rather than have the shopkeepers' revolution, the landed elite in many countries became the commercial elite, and slowly morphed from having their wealth coming from land to maybe it's now hydroelectricity, for example. So they morph it, but they don't change the basic worldview. They don't take on the entrepreneur's worldview. And I think that maybe it takes a couple of generations, and in this case, maybe a generation of young people who are taught in the U.S. business schools, for example, and brings the sort of the best practices, or what we think might be the best practices, and sort of influences that generation. What we're talking about, I think, essentially, is replacing rent-seeking behavior, manipulating political things, political factors, to get that economic payoff, versus the profit-seeking, which is really manipulating economic variables to get that profit, or those kind of incentive structures. And so, what happens, I think, is that as we follow through with this, it means that East Asia has grown faster, typically more stable, because by the time that the China and Japan and Europe get pushed out of East Asia, mostly after World War II, the sector of society that already has been created under the colonials, a bourgeois class. And so they can just move up into the ranks, if you will. Latin America doesn't have that. And what we're left with then, in some ways, is countries that do have representative governments, democracies, very fragmented parliaments. And in East Asia, you get oftentimes quite the opposite. You get one-party states of various kinds, whether it's Singapore, Taiwan. And so it's just remarkable, though. I mean, it's sort of like both are only half of the solution. But I do like what you were saying before about the Pacific Alliance, because when I think about how the world, where we're trending, where is the population going to be? Where is the growth going to be? It's going to be, so maybe I should say this a different way. For the last several hundred years, the center of the world's economy has been the Northern Atlantic. And because of these population growth, the center of the world's economy is shifting. And it looks like, I think since the early 80s, more goods in the US have gone through the Pacific than the Atlantic. And as the center of the world economy shifts more to Asia with the population, the growth, and not just the number of people, but the age of the people, that it makes sense, it seems to me, that that Latin America, South America is going to have to make a choice, whether the trains go north-south, or whether they go shipping and get integrated into the Asian economy. And I think that in many ways this is the opportunity that's presented by U.S. economic nationalism, is it gives South America a good reason to begin looking for alternatives and diversifying.
Absolutely, and I think you also touched on a really interesting point of the connection between Chicago and Chicago economic thought in Latin America, and how big of a difference that has made in some of the more stable economies in the region. And so now those are the minds that are trying to figure out this disruption that's happening globally. Now, I want to get very specific into certain countries. Antonio, I want to start with you. Mexico, U.S., Mexico, Latin American relationship, trade agreements, looking at the labor markets, currency. What are some of the biggest challenges that need to be solved today in Mexico?
Well, I would say that in Mexico, we have a real challenge with rule of law issues. And if we don't get that right, I say we as a Mexican, it'll be very difficult to keep attracting investment. For example, Mexicans and Chileans always have a friendly competition about who has more free trade agreements, right? We'll have dozens, fine. But if you don't have rule of law, and public security and respect for contracts, you will not be able to use that large network of agreements. So I think that a lot of the challenges are domestic. That being said, I do think that there are a lot of interesting opportunities. I mentioned the Pacific Alliance, but there's also the CPTPP, which used to be called the TPP, when the U.S. Was a part of that, and that includes also Canada, somewhere up north here, And Mexico, Peru, and Chile. Colombia is not a part of that, but it includes a number of very important markets in the Asia Pacific. So I think that provides an interesting opportunity to connect both north-south and east-west. But overall, I would say I'm concerned more about domestic issues, because if you don't have, rule of law, security and adequate infrastructure, sort of the basics, then you will not be able to successfully navigate in a very complicated international political economy, with the U.S. becoming not only nationalistic but unpredictable, which one does not necessarily lead to the other, but the U.S. is both nationalistic and unpredictable, and you have a very weak multilateral trading system. So I do see the opportunities, but I think there's a lot of homework to be done.
And I would say as well, Beatrice, when we talk about your country, Argentina, and we're about to go through another political cycle, we're going through a political cycle in Argentina. We were just having a conversation that 4 years ago, the discussions around Argentina were quite different from where they are today. Without knowing which direction this may go, what is Argentina's future in Latin America, relationship with U.S., where is its place?
Well, I think that we must point out, well, Argentina is going to have general elections in 1 month, and also another member from Mercosur, which is Uruguay. And so right now, the discussions that are taking place between the candidates seems to be more wide than normally we are going to see after the elections, because now we are in that period where you have to underline what your differences are, so people can understand what are they voting for. But most of all, I think that Argentina, all the candidates, the current government and the opposition, they do agree that we need trade. So nobody is considering isolation as a possibility. We need a trade to have sustainable growth and development. And we also think that trade is going to mean, because of what Mark says, that not only because of the goods and services, but also because of the age of the people, trade is going to be very related to technology. So Argentina now is providing growing knowledge-based services. So I think that that's not going to change. There are many of the main things that are not going to change because they hadn't changed with this government and the previous one, and in the last 15 years. So we can see that mostly, well, we are already established as food providers, and we are growing very fast as knowledge-based services. So I think that it's not only going to be Pacific or Atlantic Alliance, North-South, but also what kind of goods are you going to be specialized on. So I'm confident that the main lines will be more or less the same, because those are there is an agreement that those are the only way to grow. You cannot be isolated.
Absolutely. Now, Mark, talking about Brazil for a moment, we saw a lot of momentum coming earlier this year, coming out of the most recent change in their presidency. That has cooled off. It's apparent to us that that's what's happening. It's apparent to the markets that that's what's happening. We look, as Immersion, we look at Brazil as actually being a potential opportunity if you can mitigate your risk in that market. What are your viewpoints of the Brazilian market, U.S.-Brazil relationship? Is a trade agreement coming? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, when I began my career, some like 30-odd years ago, and they've been really odd, that everybody would tell me Brazil's a country of the future. And now here, 30 years later, people are still telling me Brazil's a country of the future. And so it's got so much potential. You think about countries that can be, to your point, who can really be solely independent? Brazil might be one of the few countries in the world, food self-sufficiency, energy self-sufficiency, the percentage of free water, or excuse me, of fresh water. Brazil. That's part of the challenge of the future. And so in many ways, Brazil has what you would think to be one of the big superpowers in the world. Population, it has the resources, and yet for some reason it keeps falling shy. And so most recently, as you say, there was a bit of optimism when Bolsonaro became president, and there'd be a lot of reforms, and there has been progress, and this is the sort of the optimistic side. Progress on pension reform. Pension reform is very important because it consumes a huge part of the Brazilian budget. So by fixing the pension problem, they hope they can fix the fiscal issue. And the other part of the fiscal issue is this tax simplification. And that has also been making progress, and we'll see more progress in the next month or so. However, as they do these things, the uncertainty of the investment climate, and people are waiting to get these results, especially this tax reform, that you're really seeing the economy slow down. I think in the first half this year, the Brazilian economy grew by year over year less than 1%. But this might be the worst, might be past Brazil. And it looks like they finished the second quarter on some decent momentum. So the economy is looking like it's better. Like it should be better in the next, say, over the next 18 months or so. I think that the problem is that in many ways, the US and Brazil compete. And when you look at it, you say, well, how can the U.S. compete with Brazil? The U.S. is a highly industrialized country. Brazil is still mostly agrarian exports. But yet that's what the U.S. exports. And so when China, for example, has this protein shortage between its pork and its soybeans, so if it doesn't get if there's a tariff and struggle between the U.S., where do they go? They're going to go to South America, but Brazil and also Argentina for beef, for wheat. And so in some ways, the U.S. conflict with China could be an opportunity for Latin America to expand their exports to China, which helps us get to that east-west nexus. But at the same time, I do worry that at the heart of the problem, I think to your point, is that it's not so much the unfairness of the capital markets, which is a problem. It's not the unfairness of how different things work out, the terms of trade. But I think to your point, a lot of the problems, it seems, are homegrown, domestic issues, that to be ready for this 21st century of high tech, I mean, where our cell phones have more like computer power than the lunar module that landed on the moon. This is the kind of world that we're in and that our children will be in. And so we got to fix those homegrown problems. A lot of things often begin at home, and this is one of those things I think that how to get countries ready to be able to compete in the 21st century. It's not so much getting like the northern or European countries to do more things. It's really for a lot of countries to fix their own problems. Make it easy to start a business. Make it easy to close a business. In Brazil, they had a rule that even after about 10 years, you're still responsible for employees and taxes and things like that. In the U.S., you could start a business, I think it's a couple of hours online. It might cost $100 or $200 to start a business, to get a license, to get the tax code and everything. In some countries, and it's only their own doing, it might take months to start a business and long to close a business or register property. So these are the kind of things the UN has its handbook. I might have sent you a copy. Doing business, I think the World Bank does it. It just lists all these different categories. It's like a time motion study of beginning a business to closing it down. And these are the kind of things that companies can do, but also countries need to do to set up that general environment to allow this entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. I would also say, too, that you have seen some measures. I mean, Brazil, they are working on HR-related issues, and there are ways to solve that. There's ways to use technology to create efficiencies. Chile, for example, it's become much easier to form a business. So things are gradually improving. Now, when we talk about economics, we talk about the current state of the global economy, it becomes very easy to become pessimistic. And sometimes when I have these conversations, I'd say with you, Mark, I either leave very optimistic about taking over the world, or the opposite of it, which is we're all doomed. But I want to focus now, before we open this up for questions, let's talk about opportunities. Beatrice, you touched on something I think Argentina is very strong on, and you talk about technology. Why is technology an opportunity now for Argentinian companies, for its neighbors? What's happening there?
Well, we have a very well-educated, we have three of the most important universities of Latin America. We have 4 from 6 unicorns from business based on knowledge. And we are one of the most fluent English countries. And so there are many there are many things that make, for example, we are for a different index. We have very creative Buenos Aires and Rosario and Córdoba. There are cities where there are technology poles, and and that they are working already with universities with something relatively new, because before the universities used to be like research centers, but research more in one, not so related to business. So now there is an idea closer than maybe the mindset from US. Because I think that the most important thing that we have to understand is the way of doing business is radically different from the US and Latin America, but it's not that different among the whole Latin America. So it's easier maybe to make business if you are from other Latin American country than if you are from US, because your expectations are different, because the structure is different. Our structure is maybe a little bit closer from Europe. But Argentina has a great potential on software industries. For example, coming here to Chicago, we are not only looking for partnerships and associations in all the traditional food market, which is wines and cheese and all the grains, all the agriculture, but also agtech. Argentina is leader in many agtech companies that are related to irrigation of the soil, treatment of the soil, all the things related of what we are well known for. And that's all the knowledge-based industries, which are growing at a rate like 8% per year. So, and I think they're a great opportunity. And my job here in the Midwest has a lot to do with trying to find partnerships with many American companies that are asking for resources, that kind of software information and software services provided by Argentine companies. So I invest more than half of my time, because I also have the other part, but of doing that, because that's a very interesting business doing with Midwest and Argentina.
I also think, too, that to your point about it being a little bit easier for a Latino to do business in Latin America, I also think it's a big difference coming from the U.S. side if you view Latin America as a block, if you do not view it as a singular country. Because if you view it as a block, then you're competitive with Europe, you're a competitor with Asia. In itself is, I believe, the 7th largest economy in the world. So I do view this as, yes, it is a place that there is more risk, the regulatory conditions are challenging, but if you view it as a block, there are opportunities to scale and grow your business.
There are, for example, we are now having all that opportunities in renewable energies. The prices are much higher than the US, so it's true that it might be more complicated, but the prices make the business still interesting. And that's why there are American companies going. Because you might have really like the legal frame, more complicated and needing many, but the price still makes that the region is attractive. So business are happening. And I'm working, as I told you, half of my time in that. So even though, of course, we are worried because the world is seeing some tendencies that are worrying us, but doesn't that mean that there is no room for closer economic relationships? And when we come here to the States, more or less the same. We need also sometimes a local partner. It's more or less the same.
Absolutely.
When you go to Latin America.
Last question before we turn it over to the audience. Antonio, where do you view as the current opportunities, whether you're on the U.S. side, the Mexican side, what opportunities exist?
I do think that there are a lot of Mexico-related opportunities pertaining the U.S. or perhaps other countries. First, I would say with what Mexico has, and secondly, with what Mexico needs. So what does Mexico have? to borrow a common expression from real estate, which is location, location, location. We are a part of North America, but we are also Latin American. We are what we're called Mesoamerica, in the middle of the Americas, with very good connectivity to both Europe and the Asia Pacific. So that's number one. Related to that, we are, surprise, surprise, the U.S.'s neighbor, okay? And I think that's a huge asset. Right now, given the somewhat volatile U.S. politics, both domestic and international trade policy, some people might see this as a liability, but I think long-term, overall, it's absolutely a net positive. Secondly, we have a very large domestic market. For large U.S. multinational companies, Mexico is at times seen as a site for production, but also as a destination in and of itself. A lot of, say, Illinois corn exports go to Mexico for manufacturing, for financial services. So as a market, it provides a lot of opportunities already. I would also say that Mexicans are very creative. Just because we have had an intense and complicated history, both domestically and with the northern neighbor, again. And for example, there are a lot of startups in the IT sector, just like in, I think it's mostly Buenos Aires, but Argentina are large. We have a lot of that, a lot of young entrepreneurs. For example, if you think of Hollywood, a lot of Oscar-winning directors, actors, screenwriters, cinematographers are Mexicans. For me, that's an example of Mexico. Mexicans as being very creative in order to survive in a difficult environment. So that's what we have. What do we need? I think we need much more stronger rule of law, but that's something we need to do. But I do think we need vastly improved infrastructure. So I think that's an important investment opportunity. And we're talking roads, railroads, ports, airports, to see the country as a network. If it's not network internally and towards the world, it won't be able to use the talent that it has. So I think that our geographical location with our both natural and human capital assets and the need to be networked, if I can use that expression, provides a lot of investment opportunities.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your viewpoint, Vanessa. We'll turn it over for some questions.
Thank you so much for a really great conversation thus far. I want to open it up to audience Q&A right now, and for this portion, Stephen is fair game, so please feel free to direct questions to him. He will be transitioning from his moderator role, and please don't forget to submit your questions online at ccga.live. We've already gotten a few here. For those in the room, there are roving microphones, so please wait until a microphone comes to you and speak into it for our live stream, and so we can capture it for the recording, and make sure that your question does in fact end with a question mark and it's not a statement. So with that, I'm actually going to come back to the question on the digital platform about Venezuela, but I want to tie on to what Antonio was just mentioning about infrastructure. There's a question here about China that says, you mentioned the impact of the US-China tariff fight, but China's investments in Latin America go back much further. And I think part of that has to do with infrastructure. So how do you see China's role in the region evolving over the next decade?
You want me to take that?
Sure.
Okay, first of all, what was just mentioned, that I think it's important not to see Latin America as a bloc, but as very different countries. Argentina and Brazil export a lot of grains and meat to China, whereas Mexico is basically an exporter of manufacturers, and it competes head-on with China. So I would say that economic relations between China and Mexico are much more complicated than between Brazil and China or Argentina and China. That's item number one. Item number two, I think that there are interesting opportunities for investment. I think trade is a more complicated issue, especially regarding allegations of unfair trade coming from China, say dumping of steel, things like that. So I do see an opportunity for Chinese investment in Latin America. But the way it has sometimes been done has not created sort of the best image for China, because there's a lot of labor force available in Latin America. And some companies come with their own labor force. And some countries in Latin America, I would say rightly so, don't like this. They want more of a partnership engagement rather than, turnkey project. So I think there are opportunities there to be tapped.
The worry about China and South America is that it seems to me that China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, is really looking at Asia, the Eurasian landmass, for their focus. And I think about like the loans that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank makes. I think that a lot of the loans and deals that China had, not just the trade, which seems to be kind of like a shallow type of penetration, if you will, but you really want the foreign direct investment, the building of the infrastructure. And I think the only thing worse for South America than having China in is if China doesn't come in. And I think that it's being sidestepped by looking at other opportunities more in the Eurasian continent.
Great. And then I saw an in-room question who is now gone, so we'll go to the fellow in the back.
Hi, my name is Tae-Jun. There's a topic that I guess has been in the media recently, so just wanted to get your opinion on that. The whole trade agreement between the EU and specifically Brazil, I guess they're trying to leverage political agendas around climate control and the Amazon forest. And so I've heard different perspectives that whether or not the Amazon, that there's natural burning that happens every year, it's not out of control. There's this perception there, so the French president is using this for a political agenda. I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that, on maybe what the reality would be.
Well, I think, yes, you're right. President Macron was very specific about all the climate is a very important issue in France, and it's perceived as more important in Europe than in Latin America. But the truth is that yesterday the president of Brazil was at the United Nations, and he had many conversations on the side, saying that his main interest is to have that agreement with the European Union. So I'm sure there might be some tensions, but at the end, some stress, but at the end of the day, their things are going to be agreed, the main ideas.
Well, and whether it's even appropriate or not to use kind of a political agenda for a trade agreement from a political perspective, I guess. And if it is a real issue in Brazil or not. I guess that's not being there and trying to understand the dynamics is what brought some curiosity, and if it will affect the trade in a negative way.
I cannot talk for Brazil, but I can talk as the major partner of Brazil. So I can talk about Mercosur. And Mercosur is one of the countries, is one of the groups that signed the Paris Agreement, and they are doing its reports. So there are going to be exams on how do you cope with the obligations that you have signed. That, as you know, they aren't the same for every country. So I can talk that Mercosur is really interested is already one very strong partner from the European Union. So I don't think that, as I told you, there might be stress, there might be situations that are not ideal, but at the end of the day, I'm sure that there will be some kind of agreement.
Otherwise, I have another one from the online that I know we want to ask. So we had a very wide-ranging conversation, but one thing that was not mentioned is Venezuela. So can any of you speak to the impact that Venezuela is having, the situation Venezuela is having on its neighbors in Latin America?
If you'd like, I'll take that. I've spent a lot of my time in Colombia and direct neighbor to Venezuela. I think if you look at the Venezuelan situation, over 4 million immigrants that are now dispersed throughout mostly Latin America, some here in the United States, also into the Caribbean. I believe that these are emerging economies. There's already stress from external conditions. Could be the currency, could be oil markets, commodities based. But you add in another stress that is supporting a large population, a new large population. It can really add to it can really slow economic growth. Now, in looking at and getting to know, who some of these people really are, these refugees are, they could also be an asset. They are incredibly educated. They have Venezuela for years was actually one of the larger trading partners to the United States. Multinationals coming from here, from Chicago, were headquartered there, and their South American headquarters was in Venezuela. We forget that. I think that there is tremendous opportunity for the right, the right investors that have an open mind on potential ways to utilize this talent. But ultimately, yes, it does impact these emerging markets.
No, that was something that maybe, of course, is not great for trade, but the region is receiving many, and I'm sure that's going to boost trade as soon as the political situation is more clear.
Great, thank you. Any other in-room questions? In the back there?
Hi, Antonio, you mentioned rule of laws in Mexico. And I think in Brazil, they have made a lot. Brazil, they have a lot of laws. And the problem was how to applicate the law. Because we have there a judiciary that was a little bit coward to combat corruption, for example. And from the last years, they started, after car wash operation, that's famous around the world, they started to challenge all the problems that they had, and they are creating new laws. What's your opinion about the other countries in Latin America, mainly Mexico? Do you think society and the country is prepared to apply the laws if they exist?
Yes, I think that the demand for rule of law is not only, say, from business leaders that want contracts respected and predictability. That is true, and that goes for both international businesses and Mexican businesses, but also for most Mexicans. Because if you do not have rule of law in a very effective way, you cannot combat corruption, which is a big problem. You cannot conduct business in an easy and predictable way. So I would say that there are strong calls and pressures to have the rule of law. I don't see this as something being imposed by international norms or international institutions. I'm seeing this as a huge demand of Mexicans being fed up. I think the shortcut is saying we're fed up with corruption. But for me, corruption is a symptom of inadequate rule of law. And there is just a strong cry that, basta, enough. We cannot continue doing things the way we were doing them before. So I think that's where we are. So I'm hopeful in terms of the sort of demand side. I don't know if I'm all that hopeful from the supply side of whether a solution will come.
Great. Other questions? Okay, so I have a whopper of a question on the online platform that I'm going to try to combine with another more simple one. So the simple one asks, are the trends we're seeing today, protectionism, nationalism, bilateral trade deals, driven by personality or stronger economic, political, and social forces, and are they here to stay? And the second question gives 4 different scenarios that the asker would like to know what you think is more likely to happen. So one is continued temporary diversions, i.e. nationalism, and as a temporary distraction, but things will go back to the way the old world order. Competing blocks, so we'll see a trend towards geographical regions, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and supply chains becoming more regional rather than global, so it's option 2. Option 3, constructive nationalism, so a focus on internal policies, less deference to international rules, and international commerce only embraced where it can be. or option 4, 1930s style competitive nationalism and bilateralism, i.e. significant trade protectionism, military scenarios, sharp decline in economic growth. So do we think it'll go back to the old way? We'll see it, we'll go towards regional. We will have constructive nationalism, or we're just gonna go back into the Stone Ages. So we can just go down the row and have each of you kind of give your.
Start on that side.
It's funny, it reminds me of a cartoon I saw that had a guy carrying a sign that says, "The end is nigh." And another person says to him, "Why are you so optimistic? This can last forever." So I'm concerned that this is that these trends are profound and are growing out of. It's not like we can go back to. I would suggest that the reason we have these things like economic nationalism now, this populism, is primarily because it's like a cry. It's sort of like what happened in Venezuela, one of the most richest countries in South America for 50 years. And then, but the way that they got so rich was not sustainable, the lack of rule of law, the corruption. And so what we have had since then in Venezuela seems to be like the cry of people who've gotten the short end of the stick for such a long time. And I'm afraid that that's what's happened, that this old world order that we're so fond of, because what's happening now seems so much more disruptive. But the good old days weren't so good for so many people. And so I don't think we can really go back to those good old days. They never really existed. And that I think there's sort of like once you bite from the tree, the tree of knowledge, you got to keep eating. And I think we got to go forward. And I think the way to go forward is a combination of this of growth. We want growth because that's what we have to share. That's how you can have like a rising tide that lifts everybody. You need the growth in the first place. And that's why these kind of things that you've been talking about, things that countries can do themselves, promoting trade, trying to stay on the latest industry trends like not the knowledge industries. The creativity that we need when we're dealing with all these materials. But at the same time, it seems that while there's tendencies for this globalization, there's also tendencies for this nationalism. And I think that's really what's going to be here for a while.
Well, I don't know. I think that if we see the picture with a little bit of distance, we are better than in the Middle Age, where were wars, real wars, with people really dying in a violent way. So, and for the rest, it's hard to do predictions because I really think that I do agree with Mark that maybe the old good days weren't that old and not necessarily. So it's going to be always mix of different tendencies because there is always a stress. We are always sometimes, and but I have confidence that we are clever people. We are not going to do something that is not convenient for us. So that's all I can say.
Yes, so I also think that the good old times were not all that great, and that there are legitimate criticisms of globalization's impact on the environment and global warming, about economic inequality, about having the next generations, even in the U.S., with economic perspectives that are not as good as the ones your parents had, whereas in the past you also expected your kids to be better off than you were. And you hear about these criticisms from folks that I don't consider like anti-capitalist. For example, Bill Gates talks about inequality. Martin Wolf, a well-known columnist for the Financial Times, talking about these lack of expectations, about crony capitalism and lack of effective market competition. So there are real issues. Where do I think we'll end up? I am concerned about the multilateral trading system and about multilateral rules. So I think there's somewhat of a risk of regionalism, and I think that's not the ideal way to go. I think that'll happen, especially for trade in goods. I think that it is more difficult to impose barriers on trade and services, so we might be seeing different worlds, more of a balkanization for goods, less so for services. And regarding nationalism, I think that if nationalism is seen as creating more opportunities for folks in countries where there is great income inequality, somewhat Argentina, but I mean, Brazil and Mexico are two of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of income distribution. I understand that, and there's great scope for that. You can do that within WTO rules. You can do that within NAFTA rules. So it's not a matter that the trade rules don't work. It's that maybe you don't have political and economic stability. You don't have enough venture capital. It's difficult, not a deep financial market, deep financial penetration. So I think, I don't know if I'm cautiously pessimistic, not too pessimistic, but maybe that's a term I coined. Cautiously pessimistic.
Just to wrap us up, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with certain parts of every argument. I would only add two things. Number one, history repeats itself. We've been here before. We've gotten out of it before. Maybe it was a different form. Maybe it was imperialism. Now we're talking about globalization. I would also say this, and I'm saying it from an investor perspective, is that disruption leads to opportunity. So that's probably the best way that I would leave it off.
Wonderful. Thank you. And with that, we will close today's panel and conversation. So thank you, everyone, for attending, and we'll hope to see you at a council event soon. Thank you.